Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting back into Venom. And if you are just now jumping in or starting here, you need to turn back around and read issues 1 through 9. Or you can watch my playlist in the description, because everything we're about to talk about here is going to be so confusing if you don't know the backstory. Because there's been a lot of build up to this point, and this one's all about the payoff, with us finally discovering the identity of Meridius. But with that said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch us spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so when we jump back in, we initially head back to the fight between Dylan and Bedlam in Baywater, which originally we saw take place in issue 7. And this altercation, it started as a fight, but it really turned into Dylan and the Venom symbiote getting wrecked. But this had then later led to us getting the reveal in issue 9 of Bedlam being Eddie Brock. But with the time displaced Eddie, who had been attempting to make his way back to Dylan by jumping into his own body moments before Dylan would meet him at the motel, was pushed out of his own body and that moment and dragged through the time stream a short distance into the future, trapping Eddie's mind in Bedlam's body to make Eddie watch Bedlam kill his own son. And initially Eddie's like, I'm not gonna let this happen, only for moments later to have Bedlam appear within this mindscape to tell Eddie no, he actually did this, just before opening up and devouring Eddie. And through the course of this, as much as Eddie wants to stop this, he knows that he can't, because he's simply not strong enough. And it's right there where Bedlam tells him that that's the whole point. Pain makes you stronger. And man, when you think about it, what could be more painful for Eddie than helplessly watching his son die? But the crazy thing is, this is only getting started for Eddie. Because from here, he then finds himself getting yanked millennia into the future, which once again is being done by Meridius as he pulls Eddie back to the future, back into the garden. But this time, when Eddie lands in the garden, the most mind-blowing moment of this whole series happens here. Because when Eddie arrives in the garden, it is revealed to us that he has been Finnegan this whole time, who we were introduced to in issue 5 without knowing at the time that that was Eddie's future. And it's crazy because here we relive this moment from future Eddie's perspective, which is just the beginning of a number of revelations unfolding. Because initially when Eddie arrives here as Finnegan, which is thoroughly who he's become at this point. But when he arrives here millennia in the future, he's met by Meridius in the garden, and Meridius tells Eddie, now the masks are off, Eddie Brock, and we see each other as we truly are. And he tells Eddie that he sees him as a pathetic creature. But in the stage or the phase that Eddie's in right now is to be expected. And Meridius goes on to explain that Eddie needs to be as completely broken as possible, as quickly as possible, just like he was. And Meridius goes on to tell Eddie that at one point he will become Bedlam and he will kill his own son because Meridius told him to. But with hearing this, of course, Eddie lashes out, but Meridius quickly restrains him while also letting Eddie know that attacking him is of no use because Eddie's physical form is made out of the symbiote material from this garden. And this garden was made from the corpses of the last thinking symbiotes after Meridius ate their minds. And it's from here where Meridius absorbs Eddie into himself in order to give him a crystal clear picture of what exactly is going on. Because from here he flies Eddie over the garden, showing him that it's been constructed as a huge spiral path, which is an interesting choice, a spiral. But with showing this to Eddie, he tells him that this spiral path has a long road cutting through the middle, and that road going through the middle is the true north, the present time, the moment of now. And the spiral path is the path of Eddie's life, spiraling back and forth in time, but always crossing with the present. And it's here where he shares with Eddie a very important detail, because he tells Eddie, stand at the center, look north, and you'll see 7 junctions, which is evidence of 7 paths. But this is one path 7 times, because with Eddie, who is now transitioned into Finnegan, who's quote-unquote pathetic and fearful, but Finnegan is the second path, with Eddie being the first. But with the more that he learns about these 7 paths, it's going to fill him with rage, and that's when he transitions into Bedlam, the third path. Then after that, when the rage subsides, Eddie will turn into Wild in the blue, which is the 4th. Where in that phase, cynicism remains but is masked in petty jokes. To where then next, Eddie will turn into Tiro in the green as the 5th, where at that point, Eddie's become so desperate to escape fate that it turns him into an eager student, eager to learn the ways of his future self, and that future self being Meridius, number 6, as Meridius reveals in this moment that this path leads to him. Meridius is Eddie Brock. And it's a pretty heavy reveal, but there's still something missing that we'll get to in a little bit. But from here, Meridius then drops Eddie, or Finnegan, back down in the garden. And at this point, Eddie, who from here moving forward, I'm gonna refer to quite a bit as Finnegan, with that being the current state in the true north that Eddie is in. And I could kinda see moving forward that it might get a little crazy with Eddie jumping around through these phases and these names, but every now and then I'll also throw in the number designation so it doesn't get too crazy. But it's at this point for Eddie where he tells Meridius that this can't be true, but deep down inside he knows that it is, because at this point with him becoming Finnegan the second, he knows that he's not the same Eddie, the first Eddie who had dropped in the garden. And from here, Meridius goes on to tell him that he was given the name Finnegan by his fourth self, Wild, with this version of Eddie being new to the ending and beginning cycle. And it's from here where he just loses it and he takes off, because learning all of this and what he'll become and what he's going to do to Dylan when he becomes Bedlam, it's driving him crazy. And for a moment he thinks like this has got to be Meridius playing with his head. The future can't be written in stone, there's got to be a way to change it. But as soon as he thinks this, it's right here where he then runs into that initial moment in issue 5 when Eddie, as Finnegan, ran into Eddie number 1, 4, 5, and 6. And it's here where we see the exact same events take place, but now from the perspective of Finnegan. And now it makes sense of what at the time in issue 5 had seemed random. Because at that point we had saw Finnegan rushing in trying to tell Eddie number 1 something, but we never knew exactly what it was. And on top of that, at the time we didn't know that Finnegan was Eddie. But it's here at this point that we learn as Finnegan, there's so many things rushing through his mind, because with everything that Meridius just told him, he sees his past self and he sees this as an opportunity to tell Eddie number 1 quickly about everything that's happening here before Bedlam shows up. But then of course Bedlam arrives and he snatches up Finnegan. And I'm sure some people are gonna think like, hey, he knew what was gonna happen. Why didn't he act differently? Why didn't he move differently? And I can understand that argument. But at this point, as Finnegan, he can hardly hold himself together with everything that's happened back to back up to this point, as well as the shock that he's in seeing this play out all over again. And not just because of the new perspective, but just imagine the shock of him seeing himself, Eddie number 1, leap into his rescue, with him responding as who Eddie was at that time. But when Bedlam tells Eddie number 1 that he hates him more than Finnegan, and like we've seen before, Eddie's like, why? But this time we see that Finnegan knows why, because he's seen so much more than Eddie number 1. And with Finnegan seeing this and knowing that he's looking at steps 1, 2, and 3, Eddie, Finnegan, and Bedlam, and Finnegan understands what Bedlam sees, which is his hatred for himself. And this is why in this moment, like we'd seen in issue 5, Finnegan tells Bedlam to go ahead and kill him. Kill Eddie number 1, because it's in this moment where Finnegan believes that if Bedlam, who is what Finnegan will become, if he kills Eddie, then Eddie number 1 will never become Finnegan. Finnegan will never become Bedlam, and Bedlam will never kill Dylan. And it's like, man, it seemed so random in issue number 5 when Finnegan switched on Eddie, but now it makes absolute perfect sense, because even as Finnegan, he wants to save his son. But moving forward, it continues like what we'd seen, where Bedlam drops Eddie number 1, he grabs Finnegan, and he takes off. And what's crazy this time, instead of staying with Eddie number 1, we follow Finnegan and Bedlam. And when we do, it's here we get a sneak peek into Bedlam's intentions. Because like we've seen before, we know that Bedlam is the phase after Finnegan. It's Eddie's rage. And I'm sure we're going to get a closer look at a later point when Bedlam aligns into the true north. But for now we just get a glimpse, because we find out here that Bedlam wants to kill Finnegan, so that Finnegan will never become Bedlam. And Finnegan agrees to this, but of course Meridius stops this from happening. And Meridius tells Bedlam that he has a job for him, because in the past Meridius is talking to a guy named Carson Weiss, and he wants Bedlam to jump back to that temporal location and grow into his symbiote, and then attack the boy, give him a little scare, a little knife in the heart. But with hearing this, initially I was thinking that okay, Meridius is sending Bedlam back to issue 4, because that's when we'd seen Bedlam form and go after Dylan. But back in issue 4, we saw Meridius talking to Carlton Drake, moments before Bedlam arrived, forming from Meridius, and we had seen him practically give Bedlam the same instructions. But again in issue 4, this was Carlton Drake Meridius was talking to, not Carson Weiss, which almost has me thinking for a moment that Meridius is intentionally trying to throw Finnegan off, because somewhere along the way between Finnegan and Bedlam, he gains more control on jumping through time. So it's possible this could have been done to throw off Finnegan. But as far as Carson Weiss and who he is, he had showed up briefly in Invincible Iron Man Volume 2, who we had seen in a flashback had invented the smartphone like 5 years before anyone else, only for Tony to then fire the guy during the keynote by deleting his number mid-presentation. And then 12 years later, Tony calls the guy because he needs help. Go figure. But Carson is highly intelligent, very innovative, and prior to meeting with Tony, he had already started a company making electric cars, which Tony had later partnered with him on. But at this point, it's hard to say what Carson's involvement's gonna be, whether he'll be a part of the Absent Throne, who knows. But we'll likely see more of that during the Bedlam phase or portion. But with Meridius giving Bedlam these orders, Bedlam goes at Meridius, but of course it does nothing, and Meridius tells him to just think of it as a game that he can't lose. And he tells Bedlam, either kill him, kill them, free the boy and your other from what you know is coming next, because what doesn't kill the child will make him stronger. And Meridius tells him, maybe the kid will be strong enough to beat him in the future. And he leans in and tells Bedlam, like, you do want me to lose, right? But Bedlam tells Meridius no, he wants Meridius dead. And Meridius is more or less like, okay, I get it. But he points to Finnegan and tells Bedlam that you hate him more than me. Just think of how badly this will hurt Finnegan. And right then Bedlam looks at Finnegan, he agrees, and he goes. And when Bedlam leaves, it's here where Meridius tells Finnegan that he knows that Finnegan wants to break out of the flow of these events. So he tells him that there's no way out, he's trapped here. There is no escape, not until he becomes Meridius. And it's right then where Finnegan gets the idea that Meridius is trapped here too, because Eddie becomes Finnegan, Finnegan becomes Bedlam, Bedlam becomes Wow, Wow becomes Tiro, and after Tiro you count Meridius, but that's only 6, and Meridius said there was 7. And it's right then where Finnegan realizes that there's another phase, another path that goes beyond Meridius, which means that somewhere out there, there's a 7th Venom. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below, so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.